They say St. Agatha's convent was a place where angels once sang. Hidden deep in the forest, it stood as a symbol of faith, purity, and silence. But silence can hide terrible things. Sister Maria was the youngest among the sisters, devoted, gentle, and known for praying long into the night. She believed she could hear the voice of God speaking through the wind, whispering secrets of salvation. But one winter evening, when the moon hung like a blade above the convent, her prayers took a darker turn. The sisters began hearing her voice echo through the halls, not in prayer, but in conversation. Her tone was soft, almost loving, as if answering someone unseen.
"Yes, Father, I understand," she whispered one night. "I will do as you ask."
Days passed, and Sister Maria stopped eating. She refused to speak to anyone, staring blankly at her reflection in the chapel's candlelit mirror. One morning, Mother Superior found her kneeling before the altar, blood running from her eyes, forming a perfect cross on the stone floor. "He's inside me now," she said with a trembling smile. "And he's not who you think." That night, screams echoed from her cell, shrill, inhuman. The door was locked from the inside. Yet, when they forced it open, she was gone. Only her rosary remained, twisted and burned into the wood, as if melted by unseen hands. The convent was abandoned soon after, but those who wander too close at night say they can still hear the bells tolling softly, though no one is there to ring them. And if you listen carefully, over the sound of the wind, you might hear her voice whisper, "He finally answered me." And sometimes, a second voice whispers back. The old convent of St. Verena stood like a forgotten ghost on the edge of the forest, its stone walls slick with moss, its windows clouded by time. They claimed the wind carried voices, faint murmurs that trailed through the halls when the candles flickered low. Sister Maria was new to the convent, a quiet young woman with eyes too deep for her years. She came seeking redemption, or perhaps refuge. The others said she had once served at another church, far south, where something terrible had happened, but no one dared to ask what. On her first night, as the bells struck midnight, Maria awoke to a sound behind the chapel door. A low, rhythmic whisper, like someone reciting a prayer backwards. She lit a candle and stepped closer, heart hammering. Inside, the chapel was empty, yet the crucifix above the altar swayed slightly, as if touched by unseen hands. The air grew cold. Maria's breath trembled in the dark. Then, from behind her, came a whisper, soft, almost tender. "You shouldn't have come back, Mother." The candle blew out, and for the first time, the walls of St. Verena began to whisper her name. Morning came cold and gray, the sun barely cutting through the mist that clung to the convent grounds. The sisters gathered for prayer, their chants echoing softly across the chapel. But Maria's voice faltered. Each word of Latin burned her throat like smoke. Muttered concern followed her silence, but Mother Agnes only offered a calm smile, the kind that hid fear. "New souls take time to adjust," she said softly. Yet even she could not ignore the faint scratches appearing on the pew beside Maria's hands. That night, when the convent slept, Maria returned to the chapel alone. She carried her rosary tight between her fingers. The crucifix on the altar gleamed faintly under moonlight, but something else shimmered beneath it, a small patch of disturbed floor, dust scattered as if recently moved. Kneeling, Maria began to pray. But as she whispered the Ave Maria, her voice shifted deeper, foreign, echoing from a throat not her own. The flame of her candle bent backward, away from her face, the air filled with the stench of rot and damp earth. Then a child's laugh, faint, distant, coming from beneath the floor. Maria froze, her pulse pounding as a drop of blood rolled from her nose. Somewhere below her feet, something stirred, something that had been listening all along. By dawn, Maria's candle had long burned out, yet she remained frozen by the altar, eyes fixed on the cracks in the stone floor. The faint laughter still echoed in her skull, a sound that no prayer could silence. When the other nuns found her, she sat motionless, her rosary twisted so tightly around her fingers that the beads cut into her skin. She said nothing, only stared downward, whispering one name again and again. Later, as the sisters scrubbed the chapel floor, one of them screamed. Beneath the cracked tiles, hidden under centuries of dust, lay the corner of a child's coffin. The wood was ancient, blackened with age. Mother Agnes ordered it sealed at once, forbidding anyone to speak of it. There are things, she warned, that faith should not uncover. But that night, Maria awoke to the sound of knocking. 3 soft taps coming from beneath her bed. She lifted her blanket, heart pounding, and there, through the floorboards, rose a whispering voice, thin and sweet. "Why did you leave me, Mama?" Her scream tore through the convent halls, waking every sister within. And by morning, Maria's bed stood empty, the sheets soaked through with muddy handprints. The convent was in chaos. Maria was gone. Her room stood cold and hollow, the walls smeared with streaks of damp soil. The sisters searched the grounds, the garden, the chapel, even the crypts beneath the church, but no trace of her could be found. Only the faint echo of footsteps that led into the forest and vanished among the trees. Mother Agnes clutched her cross tighter than ever. "She's not lost," she said in a trembling whisper. "She's being called." That night, the convent's silence was restless. Candles flickered with no wind, and the bells in the tower began to sway, though no hand touched them. A strange melody drifted through the halls, a lullaby, sung by a voice that wasn't human. Then, just before dawn, the chapel doors burst open. Maria stood there, barefoot, her nightgown drenched and clinging to her skin as though she had climbed from a grave. Her eyes were black, not from shadow, but from within. The sisters gasped as she staggered forward. Mud fell from her fingers. She carried something wrapped in her shawl. When Mother Agnes approached, Maria smiled, a slow, unnatural curve of her lips, and whispered, "He forgives me now. He just wanted me to find him." She opened the bundle. Inside lay a tiny skeleton, cradled like a child. And as the church bell tolled for morning mass, every window in the convent shattered at once. The sisters screamed as shards of stained glass rained down, painting the chapel floor in red and gold. Maria didn't flinch. She stood in the storm of broken light, still holding the tiny skeleton as if protecting it from harm. Mother Agnes rushed forward, shouting prayers that crumbled into echoes. "Maria, let it go. That is not your child." But Maria's head turned slowly, unnaturally, her neck cracking with each word she spoke, her voice layered as though something else was speaking with her. "He was left in the earth to rot, forgotten, but I remembered. I always remembered." Then she began to hum the same lullaby that had haunted the nights before. The air grew heavy, the candles flared blue. One by one, the sisters dropped to their knees, clutching their ears as unseen hands brushed their faces, whispering words of mourning and rage. The crucifix above the altar twisted, the figure of Christ turning its head downward, its carved eyes bleeding tar. Mother Agnes tried to perform the rite of exorcism, her voice shaking, holy water trembling in her grasp. But as the drops touched Maria's skin, they hissed, steam rising like smoke from burning flesh. Maria looked up, smiling. Water cannot cleanse what was baptized in sorrow. Then she screamed a sound so raw it split the air, and every candle in the convent went out. Darkness swallowed the sisters whole. And from somewhere in that suffocating blackness, the lullaby began again, only this time, many voices sang. The convent was swallowed in pitch-black silence. Not even the moonlight dared to pass through the shattered windows. The sisters clung to one another, their trembling whispers drowned by the faint hum of the lullaby echoing from every direction. Mother Agnes fumbled for her candle, striking a match with shaking fingers. When the flame flickered to life, it revealed a horror she would never forget. Maria, standing before the altar, surrounded by faint, child-sized shadows. They clutched at her gown, their faces blurred, their forms made of smoke and sorrow. "They never left me," Maria said softly, her eyes rolling back. They were waiting. All the children buried beneath these stones. They remember the prayers you never finished. The sisters began to pray louder, desperate, reciting verses as their candles trembled violently. The walls groaned as though alive, and water seeped through the cracks, running red. Then, a new voice joined in, deep, guttural, old. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The womb is a tomb when faith dies inside it. Mother Agnes shouted for the others to run, but their feet wouldn't move. It was as if the ground held them fast. The shadows reached for their ankles, pulling them down with icy hands. Only one sister managed to break free, sprinting toward the door. She glanced back once, just long enough to see Maria kneel before the altar, cradling the skeleton and whispering, "Hush now, my child. They'll join you soon." And then the doors slammed shut with a sound like thunder, trapping the screams inside the house of God. No one in the nearby village slept that night. The church bells of St. Verena began to ring just after midnight, slow at first, then frantic, as though invisible hands were clawing at the ropes. Yet the sisters never appeared at dawn. Only silence hung above the convent like a veil. By morning, the priest from the parish below arrived with 2 novices. The iron gates creaked open without resistance, but the courtyard smelled of damp soil and candle wax. Dead birds littered the steps. Inside, the chapel was chaos. Benches overturned, scriptures scattered and soaked. The crucifix bent forward as though bowing in grief. And there, kneeling before the altar, was Maria, still, silent, eyes half open. Her lips moved faintly, whispering something that no one could hear. Around her lay the remaining sisters, their bodies pale and stiff, rosaries clutched so tightly the beads had embedded into their flesh. The priest called her name, Sister Maria. Her head twitched. Slowly, she turned. The faint sound of children laughing filled the air. "You came to help them, didn't you?" she asked, her voice layered with another deeper, masculine, ancient. "But tell me, Father, how do you bless a grave that never closed?" The bells began to toll again, this time from above them. The priest looked toward the tower, heart pounding. The ropes moved on their own, swinging wildly until one looped itself around the neck of the novice beside him. The boy gasped, lifted from the ground by nothing but air. And as his feet thrashed helplessly, Maria smiled beneath the bleeding cross. Panic surged through the priest as he struggled to free the novice from the invisible noose. Maria's voice echoed through the chapel again, layered and unholy, speaking words none of them understood. Her pupils were now fully black, reflecting the candle flames like dark mirrors. Suddenly, Maria lunged forward with unnatural speed. The novice fell to the floor as her fingers, twisted and jagged, clawed at the air around him. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch toward her, merging with her body. Mother Agnes tried to intervene, holding a crucifix high, but the cross rattled violently in her hand, as though resisting her. A sudden force slammed her backward into the altar, leaving her gasping and bruised. The priest grabbed the holy water, flinging it toward Maria, but she barely flinched. Wherever the droplets touched her, they hissed and burned her skin, leaving blistered marks that steamed in the cold air. Then she screamed a high, piercing wail that shook the very foundation of the chapel. The windows cracked, and the floor beneath them trembled as if some ancient earth beneath the convent was awakening. And from the shadows came the first whispers of the child, soft and sorrowful. "Mama, why did they leave me?" The priest and sisters froze. Whatever had taken Maria now had a voice of its own, and it was hungry for justice. As the echoes of Maria's scream faded, the chapel fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The priest and Mother Agnes dared not speak. Only the faint sound of scratching came from beneath the floorboards, like tiny claws scraping against stone. Maria knelt, cradling the tiny skeleton she had brought earlier, whispering in voices that weren't hers. Father Steve finally forced himself closer. "Maria, what happened? What is this?" Her head lifted, eyes fully black, and she spoke 3 voices overlapping in one terrifying chorus. It started long before I came here. A secret hidden in the heart of the church. A child buried alive, forgotten by those who swore to protect it. Father Neil, the vows, the lies. Mother Agnes trembled, realizing the truth she had long buried. Maria's unborn child had been taken from her, hidden, and left in the cold earth to die. The voices whispered around them, telling of betrayal, grief, and vengeance. Maria rose slowly, the shadows clinging to her like a living cloak. Her every movement seemed unnatural, her joints bending in impossible angles. The air grew colder, and the chapel seemed to shrink around them. You cannot hide the truth. The child remembers, and I am its voice. A sudden gust extinguished the candles. Darkness swallowed them, leaving only Maria and the faint, eerie laughter of the spirit. The exorcism had not begun yet, and already the convent was becoming a tomb. Darkness clung to every corner of the chapel, broken only by the flicker of one trembling candle. Maria's black eyes glowed like embers, and the shadows around her writhed as if alive. The skeleton she held now seemed to twitch in her arms, its tiny bones rattling with an unnatural rhythm. Father Edmund arrived just before dawn, holy water in hand. He knelt and began to recite prayers, his voice steady but tense. Maria's head jerked toward him, and a strange, multi-layered laugh echoed through the air, part child, part woman, part something older, darker. The candle flames bent backward, away from her, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Cold air pressed against the priest's chest, as though the building itself exhaled with the spirit's rage. You cannot free me. I belong here, and I belong to her. Maria's voice, or rather, the spirit's voice, whispered through her. The tiny skeleton's jaw moved in perfect mimicry, a grin wider than any human face. Father Edmund flung holy water at her, but it hissed and burned, leaving bubbling marks on her skin. The whispers of the dead children grew louder, circling the chapel like a choir of vengeance. They took my life. They buried me. Now you will feel what I felt. The floorboards cracked beneath them, tiny fissures snaking outward. The exorcism had begun, but the spirit was awake, and it was hungry. The chapel trembled as Maria's body contorted unnaturally. Her arms bent backward, and she let out a piercing scream that rattled the stone walls. Father Edmund's voice rose in prayer, holy water spraying in wide arcs, but every drop that touched her skin hissed violently, burning like acid. Suddenly, Maria lunged toward Mother Agnes with terrifying speed. The older nun barely had time to raise her crucifix before Maria's twisted fingers struck it aside, shattering it into pieces. The shadowy forms of the dead children surged from the corners of the chapel, slamming into the sisters with crushing force. Candles toppled, igniting pews. Smoke filled the room, thick and choking. Maria's eyes glowed black, reflecting the flames as her laughter layered, inhuman echoed through the chapel. Father Edmund tried to grab her, but her strength was impossible. She lifted the tiny skeleton, holding it like a shield, and whispered in multiple voices at once. You cannot stop what has been buried. The floor cracked under the weight of unseen forces, and a deep rumble shook the foundation. Something alive stirred beneath the convent, answering Maria's call. The exorcism had begun in earnest, and already the convent was becoming a battlefield between the living, the possessed, and the dead. Smoke and ash filled the chapel, the flames licking the walls as Maria staggered toward the altar, her movements jerky and unnatural. The whispers of children grew louder, forming words that cut through the chaos. She is ours. She carries us. She remembers. Mother Agnes and the surviving sisters huddled in the corner, clutching each other as Maria's shadow stretched across the walls, twisting like a living creature. Every step she took left blackened footprints that burned the floor beneath her. Father Edmund raised his voice, chanting prayers. But the air itself seemed to push back against him. Candles flared blue and then went out, leaving them in near darkness. Maria lifted the tiny skeleton above her head, her layered voices now screaming in unison, bouncing off the stone walls. The The whispers of the dead children became a deafening chorus, echoing every betrayal, every sorrow, every grave injustice buried beneath the convent. One by one, the sisters fell unconscious, their bodies writhing as unseen hands dragged them toward the floor. Mother Agnes screamed and reached for Maria, but the young nun's body twisted impossibly, spinning on its own axis before slamming against the altar with a bone-cracking thud. Father Edmund stumbled back, realizing that the exorcism was no longer just about Maria. The entire convent had become a cage for vengeful spirits, and one wrong step could doom them all. The ground beneath the chapel groaned, as if the earth itself were waking from a long sleep. Maria stood in the center, the tiny skeleton held tightly, shadows crawling along the walls like living things. Her black eyes glimmered with fury and grief. Father Edmund sprinkled holy water, chanting louder than ever, but the floorboards buckled beneath Maria's feet, cracks snaking outward in jagged patterns. From these fissures, something dark and writhing began to emerge, shapes that were neither shadow nor solid, moving like smoke infused with rage. Mother Agnes screamed as one of these forms reached for her, chilling her blood with icy fingers that burned like fire. The sisters tried to flee, but the cracks seemed to open under their feet, swallowing the floorboards and threatening to drag them into the darkness below. Maria's voice layered with the whispers of children, calling out names no one had ever heard. They took us. They left us to rot. Now, they will pay. The chapel walls trembled, candles toppled and flared into blue flames, and the crucifix above the altar twisted, as if bending toward the screaming nuns. Father Edmund's heart pounded. The exorcism had become a battle not just for Maria's soul, but for the very ground beneath their feet. The chapel's darkness throbbed with a sinister pulse. Every crack in the floor seemed alive, moving like veins carrying shadowy energy. Maria stood at the center, her black eyes glowing brighter, the tiny skeleton cradled in her arms. The whispers of the dead became louder, merging into a horrific, dissonant choir that filled every corner of the building. Father Edmund raised his hands, reciting prayers with desperation. Each word was met with resistance, the air itself pushing back, the echoes of the children's voices distorting his chants. Suddenly, Maria's head jerked unnaturally, her mouth opening in a silent scream. From it poured hundreds of tiny, ghostly voices, all repeating the same lament. Buried, forgotten, betrayed. The sisters screamed as shadows surged from the walls, wrapping around them, lifting them from the floor. One nun vanished entirely, her cries swallowed by the darkness. Maria lifted the skeleton high, and with a thunderous wail, the floor cracked wider. From the fissures, the spirits of other buried children clawed upward, their faces twisted with rage and sorrow. Father Edmund flung holy water, chanting louder. Each drop that landed on Maria hissed like acid, but she did not falter. Instead, the skeleton in her arms rattled, and a voice ancient and wrathful spoke through her. All who hide the truth shall burn. The chapel trembled violently, and the exorcism descended into chaos. Every prayer felt as if it were being swallowed by the spirits themselves. Maria's body twisted unnaturally, bending at impossible angles as the voices of the dead surged through her. Her layered screams filled the chapel, bouncing off the stone walls, shaking the rafters above. The tiny skeleton in her arms rattled violently, its jaw snapping open and shut as though speaking in its own tongue. Father Edmund tried to hold his ground, splashing holy water and shouting prayers, but every droplet that touched her sizzled and burned. Shadows peeled off the walls and merged with Maria, wrapping around her limbs like living chains. Mother Agnes screamed as Maria lunged forward, the air thick with the stench of decay. The young nun's strength was no longer her own. Something far older and far angrier moved within her. You stole us. You buried us. We are not silent. The chorus of voices cried through her mouth. Each word caused the floor to tremble, tiles cracking and splintering beneath them. The sisters huddled together, powerless, as Maria's figure became a conduit for something ancient and merciless. The exorcism was no longer a ritual. It was a battle against the wrath of countless lost souls, each demanding vengeance through her. The chapel walls began to sweat blood, and the air grew so cold that the sister's breath froze in midair. Maria's eyes, fully black now, turned toward Father Edmund. "You think prayers can save you?" she hissed, voice layered and inhuman. And with that, the first direct strike came. Her hand shot forward, bending the priest backward as if he weighed nothing. The chapel shook violently as Maria's scream tore through the stone walls. The floor beneath her groaned and buckled, fissures racing outward like black veins. From the cracks emerged something alive, shadowy hands, clawing and grasping, reaching for anyone nearby. Father Edmund staggered backward, clutching his holy water as the first nun was dragged toward the widening gap. Screams echoed as the shadows swirled, merging with Maria, making her appear larger, more monstrous. Mother Agnes grabbed a candle stand and swung it, trying to reach Maria, but the shadows ripped it from her hands, sending flames shooting across the chapel. The tiny skeleton in Maria's grasp rattled violently, and the whispers of the dead children swelled into a cacophony of accusations and cries. "You left us. You buried us alive." Maria's body arched unnaturally, her mouth opening impossibly wide as a voice, ancient and wrathful, spoke through her. "Now all will know our pain." The cracks beneath them widened further, and a chilling wind rushed upward from the depths, extinguishing candles, tossing books into the air. Dust and ash swirled in the room, filling lungs and choking screams. The convent had become a battlefield between the possessed and the living, a cage where the dead demanded justice, and Maria was their vessel. The chapel erupted in chaos. Flames sprang from the broken pews, twisting upward like serpents, licking at the walls. Maria stood in the center, her black eyes reflecting the fire, the tiny skeleton trembling in her grasp as though feeding on the inferno. The shadows around her writhed and screamed, merging with her body. Every word she spoke carried multiple voices, children, women, men, and something far older. "They took what was mine. Now you will burn with us." Father Edmund flung holy water with all his strength, but the droplets hissed and evaporated instantly, leaving scorch marks on the stone floor. Mother Agnes screamed as she tried to reach Maria, only to be slammed against the altar by an invisible force. The wind howled through the shattered windows, carrying the smell of ash and decay. The chapel bells rang of their own accord, each toll sending waves of terror through the sisters. Maria raised the skeleton high, and with a guttural, layered scream, the fire flared higher, burning brighter, consuming everything in the room. The shadows coiled around the remaining sisters, dragging them toward the floor's widening cracks. The exorcism had transformed into a battle for survival. Every second that passed, the spirits within Maria grew stronger, hungrier, and more relentless. Amid the roaring flames and shrieking shadows, Maria's gaze fell on the crucifix above the altar. Slowly, impossibly, her twisted fingers reached upward. With one violent pull, the crucifix tore from the wall, splintering into jagged pieces as it hit the floor with a deafening crash. The shards of wood seemed to tremble as if alive, and a dark mist oozed from the broken Christ figure. The chapel shook violently, dust and debris falling like rain. The screams of the sisters mixed with the cacophony of the dead, creating a nightmare symphony that pierced every corner of the building. Father Edmund's voice trembled as he shouted prayers, holding his hands high. The holy water in his grasp began to shake violently before spilling to the floor. Where it touched the tiles, steam and sizzling marks appeared, proof that even divine protection struggled here. Maria raised the tiny skeleton toward her black eyes, whispering in layered voices that sounded like 100 tongues speaking at once. You cannot stop what was buried, what was forgotten. The shadows surged from the cracks in the floor, wrapping around the sisters. One by one, the women were lifted into the air, their cries swallowed by the darkness. The convent had become a place of fire, shadow, and impossible terror. The exorcism teetered on the edge of failure, and the spirit within Maria was only beginning to show its full power. After the chaos of fire and shadows, a sudden stillness fell over the chapel. The flames dimmed, the smoke hung heavy, and the whispers of the dead faded to a low, ominous hum. But the silence was worse than the noise. It was alive, pressing against the living, freezing their hearts. Maria stood in the center, perfectly still, the tiny skeleton cradled in her arms. Her black eyes scanned the room, reflecting the faint candlelight, and a faint, twisted smile curled her lips. Every breath of air felt heavy, laden with the presence of unseen entities. The sisters, trembling on the floor, dared not move. Father Edmund stepped forward cautiously, clutching the holy water. He whispered prayers, but even his voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Suddenly, a soft, almost imperceptible tapping began beneath the cracked floorboards, slow, deliberate. Then, it became footsteps, echoing from places that should have been empty. The shadows began to stretch again, crawling along the walls toward the living, forming clawed fingers that sought to pull them into the darkness. Maria's voice broke the silence, layered and harsh. "You cannot hide from us. We are here, and we remember." The chapel doors slammed shut on their own, trapping everyone inside. Outside, the wind howled like a chorus of the dead, promising that the horrors were far from over. The shadows in the chapel began to pulse, moving as if they had a life of their own. They stretched across the walls, slithering like serpents, crawling toward the trapped sisters with relentless precision. Maria stood at the center, black eyes glowing, whispering in multiple voices, each one echoing from the depths of the dead. Father Edmund tried to recite prayers faster, holy water trembling in his hands. The droplets that touched Maria hissed, burning her skin, but did nothing to slow the shadows. Mother Agnes screamed as one shadow reached for her, wrapping around her arms like icy chains. The nun struggled, but the more she resisted, the tighter the grip became. The tiny skeleton in Maria's hands rattled violently, and a guttural, inhuman voice joined the chorus. "You will all remember. You will all pay." A gust of wind knocked over the remaining candles, plunging the chapel into darkness, save for the eerie glow from Maria's eyes. The shadows surged forward, faster and stronger, their whispers merging into a deafening roar of rage. Father Edmund realized with horror that this was no ordinary possession. Maria had become a vessel, a doorway for vengeful spirits that could not be contained. The exorcism was now a fight for survival, and the spirits were winning. The chapel shook as the whispers grew into a deafening roar. Maria's voice layered with the spirits of the dead, each word dripping with fury and sorrow. The tiny skeleton rattled violently, its jaw moving as if shouting in tandem with her, and the shadows around her twisted into grotesque, almost human forms. Mother Agnes and the surviving sisters screamed as the dark shapes lunged, their icy hands brushing against skin, freezing blood in their veins. Every prayer and holy word seemed swallowed by the oppressive air, powerless against the torrent of vengeful energy. Father Edmund flung holy water desperately, watching it sizzle and evaporate where it touched Maria. Her head jerked unnaturally, her mouth opening wide as a chorus of voices erupted. "You buried us, you abandoned us, now you will suffer as we did." The chapel walls began to sweat black ichor, dripping onto the floor. Candles exploded in fiery bursts, throwing shadows that danced like living demons. The ceiling trembled, as if the building itself were about to collapse. Maria's laughter pierced the air, layered and haunting, echoing through every crack and crevice. "No one leaves, no one survives, not now, not ever." Father Edmund realized with terror that this exorcism was no longer about freeing Maria. It was about surviving the wrath of countless souls, unleashed souls that now claimed the chapel as their own. The chapel trembled violently, dust and debris raining from the rafters. The shadows, now thick and writhing, surged toward the remaining sisters like a living tide. Maria stood at the center, a twisted conductor orchestrating the chaos, the tiny skeleton rattling wildly in her hands. Father Edmund shouted prayers, his voice cracking with fear, but the words seemed meaningless against the growing storm of vengeful energy. Every step he took was met with resistance, as if the floor itself sought to swallow him. Mother Agnes screamed, trying to pull the sisters to safety, but one by one they were snatched by the shadows, dragged toward the widening cracks in the floor. Screams echoed, mingling with Maria's layered, inhuman laughter. The altar itself split, shards of stone and wood flying like deadly missiles. Candles exploded in fiery bursts, setting the remaining pews ablaze. Maria's voice rose above the chaos, chanting in multiple tongues, summoning more shadows from the fissures. "You cannot escape. The buried demand justice. The forgotten will have their vengeance." The walls of the chapel shook, splintering as the roof groaned. Father Edmund realized with a sinking heart. The exorcism was failing. The spirits had claimed this place, and survival was slipping further from their grasp. The chapel was a nightmare of fire, shadows, and screams. Maria stood at the epicenter, her black eyes glowing like twin voids, the tiny skeleton rattling violently as if echoing the wrath of the dead. The walls groaned under the strain of the unleashed spirits, and the floor cracked with jagged, spreading fissures. Father Edmund raised the last vial of holy water, voice trembling but determined. "By the power of God, I command you to leave her!" Maria's head whipped toward him. Her layered voices shrieked, a cacophony of rage and sorrow. "You cannot command what is ours. We will have justice." Shadows lunged, flames flared, and the air became thick with choking smoke. The skeleton in her hands rattled, the tiny bones glowing with an unholy light. Maria's body arched unnaturally, twisting in ways that should have been impossible. Mother Agnes screamed, trying to reach Maria, but the young nun struck the air, sending a wave of invisible force that threw her against the altar. The priest stumbled but held firm, splashing holy water in sweeping arcs. Each drop that hit Maria burned, but she did not falter. The spirits now fueled her strength. A deafening crack split the air as the floor beneath Maria opened slightly, revealing a black void, writhing with shadowy forms. Father Edmund's heart raced. This was the final moment. Either the spirits would be expelled, or the entire convent would fall into darkness forever. Maria's lips curled into a terrifying grin, and the voices of the dead screamed in unison. Justice, vengeance, blood. A blinding light erupted as Father Edmund flung the last of the holy water onto Maria. The screams of the dead shattered into a single, piercing wail, then silence. Maria collapsed, trembling and weak, the tiny skeleton slipping from her hands and landing on the scorched floor. The chapel was in ruins, shattered pews, burned candles, smoke-stained walls, and deep cracks running across the floor. The shadows that had terrorized them were gone, leaving only an eerie stillness. Mother Agnes rushed to Maria's side, holding her trembling form. Her black eyes slowly cleared, leaving behind a frightened, exhausted young woman. The weight of the possession had left her weak, her body bruised and broken, but free. Father Edmund knelt, exhausted and bloodied, surveying the devastation. 2 lives had been lost in the chaos, and the convent would never recover fully from the horror that had unfolded. The holy water had purged the spirits, but the scars remained both physical and spiritual. Maria whispered, barely audible, "It's over. It's finally over." Yet in the corners of the ruined chapel, faint shadows lingered. Whispers of the dead, soft and sorrowful, promised that some memories of vengeance never truly fade. The convent would close, but the story of Maria, her lost child, and the spirit's wrath would haunt those who survived forever. And so the night ended not with peace, but with a silence that carried the weight of horrors no one would ever forget. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, pale and colorless, touching the convent with an eerie calm. The forest around it was lifeless. Not a bird stirred, not a branch moved. Even the wind seemed afraid to enter. The chapel doors hung open, swinging gently, though no one had passed through. Inside, the floor was dry, the pit sealed once more, as if it had never existed. But the walls were stained with faint handprints, small, childlike, climbing toward the ceiling. Mother Agnes stood alone before the altar, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. The sisters who survived the night sat in silence, their minds fractured by what they'd seen. No one spoke of the mirror or the bell or the footsteps that echoed long after they'd stopped hearing them. Then, a single sound broke the silence, the faint clatter of beads against stone. Agnes turned. In the doorway lay a rosary, its chain snapped, the crucifix scorched black, the same one Maria had worn. She bent to pick it up, and as her fingers brushed the beads, a whisper filled the chapel, soft, childlike, almost tender. "Mother?" The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The candles flickered, the air grew cold, and the scent of ash returned. Agnes backed away slowly, clutching the rosary to her chest. "Be at peace," she whispered. "Your suffering is over." But the whisper answered, almost laughing, "Peace? You built this place on our graves." The chapel doors slammed shut, every candle extinguished. Darkness swallowed the room. When the villagers arrived days later, they found the convent empty. The rooms were neat, untouched, as if the nuns had simply vanished. Only a single mirror remained, standing in the chapel, its surface clean and still. And if one dared to look closely, they could see faint figures moving within it. A group of sisters kneeling in eternal prayer, and among them, Maria, holding the hand of a small child, smiling at the viewer from the other side. The dawn came, but the convent never woke again. The convent was silent now, too silent. The air felt thick, filled with the scent of smoke and something older, sour, like decay trapped in the walls. The sisters had gathered what few candles still burned and retreated to the dormitory. But even there, the shadows were wrong. They stretched and twisted across the walls, as if moved by a light that wasn't there. Sister Helena sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the letter she had found, her lips moving in endless prayer. Across from her stood an old mirror, its surface cracked, its frame blackened with soot. It had survived the last fire decades ago, or so the archives said. She tried not to look at it, but mirrors have a way of demanding attention. When she finally raised her eyes, she froze. The reflection didn't match the room. The beds were empty, the walls burned, and at the center stood Maria, her habit torn, her face calm but drained of life. Her lips were moving silently, whispering words Helena could not hear. Helena rose trembling. "Maria," she whispered. Maria's reflection smiled faintly, her eyes hollow, black as candle smoke. Then, slowly, she raised her hand, and so did Helena, unable to stop herself. It was as if invisible strings bound her body to the mirror's command. "Mother," the reflection murmured, though Helena's mouth never moved. "He still cries for me." The surface of the mirror began to ripple, liquid and dark. Ashes swirled inside it, forming the faint outline of a small child reaching upward, fingers pressing against the glass from within. Helena screamed and threw the crucifix at the mirror. The glass shattered, but instead of falling, the shards hung suspended in midair, each one reflecting Maria's face. Then the pieces burst outward, scattering across the room like knives. When the other sisters arrived, they found Helena kneeling before the mirror's empty frame, eyes wide open, whispering Maria's name over and over. But the mirror was no longer empty. Now it reflected the dormitory exactly, except for one extra figure standing behind them all, smiling. Night fell heavy upon the convent. The forest beyond the stone walls stood unnaturally still. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the faint hum of insects. It was as if the world itself held its breath. The sisters gathered in the chapel, their faces pale, their prayers trembling. They tried to drown the unease with hymns, but their voices cracked under the weight of dread. Then, from the tower above, came the first toll of the bell. One slow chime. It wasn't possible. The rope had been cut and the bell sealed ever since Maria's possession began. Yet it rang its sound hollow and wet, like metal dipped in blood. The second chime followed, echoing through the forest, bending the air around them. Mother Agnes looked up toward the bell tower. "No one goes up there," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Sister Helena had already started climbing the spiral stairs, clutching a candle that flickered with every breath. Each step felt heavier, as though the tower itself resisted her, and with every chime, the sound changed from bronze to something else, something human. By the seventh toll, it wasn't a bell anymore. It was a child's cry, high-pitched, echoing in agony. When Helena reached the top, the candle went out. The great bell hung still, unmoving, yet it continued to wail, its mouth dripping a dark red liquid that spattered across the stones below. Inside the hollow of the bell, she saw it a small, skeletal hand pressed against the metal, as if trapped within. Helena screamed and stumbled back down the steps. The sound followed her, the ringing turning into shrill laughter, echoing through every corridor. Below, the nuns covered their ears, weeping in terror. But the bell kept tolling, over and over, each strike pulling something from the ground outside, as though calling the buried dead to wake. By the 13th chime, the convent's lights went out, and in the darkness, the crying did not stop. The exorcism had ended hours ago, but the air still trembled with whispers. Candles refused to stay lit, flickering out, as if suffocated by something unseen. The sisters tried to clean the chapel to wash away the blood that had spilled during Maria's final convulsion, but no matter how much holy water they poured, the stains returned, darker, thicker, alive. Then, as dawn bled through the broken stained glass, the ground began to shake. The altar cracked in half, a deep fissure crawling across the stone floor like a living vein. Dust filled the air, and from the fracture seeped a thick black liquid that smelled of rot and iron. Mother Agnes fell to her knees. "No," she whispered, clutching her cross. "This cannot be." But the earth groaned again, louder, deeper, and the floor collapsed entirely, revealing a pit beneath the chapel. The nuns peered into the darkness and saw bones, hundreds of them packed together in a mound of ash and mud. Not all of them were adult-sized. At the center of the pit lay a small skeleton, wrapped in a fragment of torn habit cloth. A rosary was clenched in its tiny hand, the same design Maria wore. The sisters screamed. One of them fainted. Mother Agnes could only stare, trembling as she realized the truth. The convent had been built on a burial ground, not of saints, but of sinners, discarded and unblessed. And now, their blood was waking. Night fell heavy upon the convent. The forest beyond the stone walls stood unnaturally still. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the faint hum of insects. It was as if the world itself held its breath. The sisters gathered in the chapel, their faces pale, their prayers trembling. They tried to drown the unease with hymns, but their voices cracked under the weight of dread. Then, from the tower above, came the first toll of the bell. One slow chime. It wasn't possible. The rope had been cut, and the bell sealed ever since Maria's possession began. Yet it rang its sound hollow and wet, like metal dipped in blood. The second chime followed, echoing through the forest, bending the air around them. Mother Agnes looked up toward the bell tower. "No one goes up there," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Sister Helena had already started climbing the spiral stairs, clutching a candle that flickered with every breath. Each step felt heavier, as though the tower itself resisted her. And with every chime, the sound changed from bronze to something else. Something human. By the seventh toll, it wasn't a bell anymore. It was a child's cry, high-pitched, echoing in agony. When Helena reached the top, the candle went out. The great bell hung still, unmoving. Yet it continued to wail, its mouth dripping a dark red liquid that spattered across the stones below. Inside the hollow of the bell, she saw a small skeletal hand pressed against the metal, as if trapped within. Helena screamed and stumbled back down the steps. The sound followed her, the ringing turning into shrill laughter, echoing through every corridor. Below, the nuns covered their ears, weeping in terror. but the bell kept tolling, over and over, each strike pulling something from the ground outside, as though calling the buried dead to wake. By the 13th chime, the convent's lights went out. And in the darkness, the crying did not stop.